right, my homeboys and girls, welcome back to another wonderful episode here. Hopefully, you're staying safe and staying up to date on all of the work you have going on, all the preparations you have going on for not only the APUSH exam, but the others as well. So, essentially, today's lecture is going to focus on period 3 of history. This goes from about 1754, okay, the end of that French Indian War, up through about 1800. So the American Revolution, the road to the Revolution, and then our first couple presidents included in all of that narrative. So what are the big ideas? We're going to talk about England attempting to reassert their control after the French Indian War. We'll talk about why that is. We'll talk about how the colonies react to that, how they eventually declare independence, and then become that new country, America. Next, disagreements arise over the social, political, and economic identity of this new country. What is it going to look like? What's our laws going to look like? What's the government going to look like? Who's going to be in control? Who can vote? Who can't? Etc. All right, so we'll talk about all that in this lecture. Now, important to know, England attempts to put the colonies in check after the period of solitary neglect. Remember yesterday we had mentioned solitary neglect being the period in which England was very lackadaisical in enforcing those mercantile laws like the Navigation Acts, for example. Sir Edmund Andros comes along and says, okay, we're going to enforce these mercantile laws strictly, and then if it weren't for the Glorious Revolution, okay, maybe we would have had that revolution a little bit earlier, but the Glorious Revolution essentially relaxes those mercantile laws. We go back to solitary neglect, but now solitary neglect is going to come to an end with this big conflict here. So prior to 1763, the map there shows, the French in that like teal greenish color. They have a lot of land in the New World. The British have basically the 13 colonies. However, after the 7 Years' War, or as we call in America, the French and Indian War, we now have a very different looking map on the right-hand side of your screen there. So the British take over and they basically kick out the French because they win the French-Indian War. And big thanks to George Washington, who does actually fight in this war for the British. Now, big turning point in our relationship with the British, because what they're going to do is after this war kind of blame the Americans, or the colonists I should say, for the war. And being they blame us, that means we're going to be responsible for paying for the debt that mounted in this war. So how are they going to pay off this debt? England is going to assert a lot of new taxes on these colonists. And on the left-hand side here, you can see various laws, including some taxes that the British will impose upon us. We talked about the mercantile laws, Navigation Acts in the other lecture, where it says, hey, listen, you have to trade with England. If you want to trade with anyone else, it has to go through our ports. Because of the French-Indian War, they set the proclamation line of 1763. It says you cannot go past the Appalachian Mountains. They're limiting our manifest destiny. Remember, we don't like that. Sugar Act, okay, self-explanatory, tax on sugar. Stamp Act, self-explanatory, tax on stamps. However, stamps aren't just, for mailing letters. They're all official documents like newspapers, etc. Quartering Act, that means soldiers, British soldiers were allowed to come into your home and you're supposed to let them stay in your bed and feed them a couple of meals, and obviously that's not going to go well with quite a few colonists. The Declaratory Act basically is saying, hey, listen, England has the right to declare that any law that they pass will or can be imposed upon you. You're our subjects and we can do this to you. Township Act, okay, more various taxes upon the colonists. Tea Act, self-explanatory. The Intolerable Acts as a result of the Boston Tea Party, and also a result technically of the Tea Act. Quebec Act, we briefly mentioned, this had nothing to do with the colonists, but in the territory of Quebec, the British took away their the subjects' representative government and also imposed upon them Catholicism, which Protestantism, and basically that was scaring the colonists and the 13 colonies because, are they going to make us a certain religion, or are they going to take away our representative government? So it just has a little bit of a scaring effect on the 13 colonies. On the right-hand side, these are results of what we saw on the left, the Stamp Act riots and Stamp Act Congress. People get together and they're obviously upset about the Stamp Acts. They're rioting, and then they gather and write the king a letter and say, please repeal these. And the king basically crumples up that piece of paper and throws it out. Awesome. Sons of Liberty, led by the guy, good old Sam Adams, and he is also going to be behind the Boston Tea Party, which we know about. Okay, Boston Tea Party, a result of the Tea Act, and a result of the Boston Tea Party will be the Intolerable Acts, which basically shut down Boston Harbor, and it really punishes the colonists for the Boston Tea Party. Committees of correspondence also set up by good old Sam Adams. He is trying to basically connect with his boys in the other colonies and let them know what's going on. And then finally, we'll have the Continental Congresses, where we have the representatives from most of the colonies get together, talk about what to do, what actions to take now that England seems to be really pissed off with us. Okay, so what we're seeing here is a very slow movement towards the American Revolution. It's not exactly like all of a sudden it flips a switch and everybody's on board. Although guys like Sam Adams may be on board, not everybody's on board with him right away. So what kind of inspires the American Revolution? There are various things, like the Enlightenment, okay, the ideas from those guys from the Enlightenment that say, hey, listen, people should have a say and there shouldn't be a tyrant in power and things like that. The colonial elites, guys like John Adams later on, and George Washington, Sam Adams. Okay, those guys are the elites. The movements that we see more so in the North, okay, specifically in Massachusetts, as opposed to those southern colonies. Why do the colonies win the war? Well, there's various reasons. One, home field advantage, but really the French. We really owe the French a big one, because without their support, we certainly would not have won this war. Superior leadership, that really is owed to George Washington. He is the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Although he had a lot of troubles in doing so, he does pull out the victory in the end, obviously, and everything he decides turns out to be a really good idea. So, barring any in-depth analysis of his specific difficulties, we'll just say George Washington, he did it all on his own, pretty much. Creation of new government structures. We're going to create a brand new government. At first, very weak centralized government, then later on a stronger centralized government. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And everything is based upon the Enlightenment principles. Okay. What else? The impacts, the social and political impacts of the American Revolution. Politically, it was not a very radical movement, because you got to remember, after the revolution is over, the colonial elites are still in power. They're still the ones that are voting. You don't have minorities in charge, things like that. Internationally, we'll see other revolutions be a result of the American Revolution. We'll talk more about the French Revolution a little bit. Women, where is their roles expected to be? We've always talked about this term all year long, Republican motherhood. They're supposed to be in the home, and they're supposed to be raising those children to be good citizens, good Republicans in that sense. Abigail Adams tells her husband John when he goes off to the Constitutional Convention, remember the ladies, and then he forgets the ladies. Thank you so much, John. African Americans, we will see certain gradual emancipation laws in certain states, for example, like Pennsylvania. If you remember talking about this, gradual emancipation means that the children of slaves would be born free, and as time goes on, obviously, slavery would be they'll outgrow slavery in those states. That's mostly, though, northern states, because in the South, they're still going to have slavery. And then that turning point for slavery is going to be the invention by Eli Whitney, the cotton gin. We'll talk about that later on. Native Americans, they are not protected by the new constitutions. They're not protected by any of this. Unfortunately, there's a long narrative and a long story about Native Americans, and we kind of know it's a very sad story. So, new government structures we talked about based upon the Enlightened ideas. Thomas Paine, his common sense, Declaration of Independence, all that. Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, these guys are the embodiment of the Enlightenment here in America, and they create our government based off those Enlightened ideas. The first type of government we create, the Articles of Confederation, weak, centralized government. The states were to have more power. Why is that? Well, they didn't want to recreate a strong central government like a monarchy, like the English had. Definitely know some of the successes and the failures of the Articles. Successes being they're the ones that helped win the American Revolution. They set up new precedents of how states would enter the Union. Failures, example, there was no way to collect taxes. Okay, so there's a lot more failures of the Articles than there are successes, but definitely know them. The Constitution will replace the Articles of Confederation, and we'll talk more about the Constitution, but definitely know about things like separation of powers and checks and balances and the three branches of government, things like that. When it comes to the constitutional issues, when we're setting this all up, we have to know that there was a big argument between the two sides as far as how states would be represented in this new government. There was the Virginia plan, which was the large state plan versus the New Jersey plan or the small states plan. So basically, the Virginia plan wants all of the states to be based upon population. Large states would have a bigger say. And the New Jersey plan says, no, why don't we all be equal? Doesn't matter upon your population, everybody's equal. Well, those are the two sides. They come together in what we call the Great Compromise, or sometimes referred to as the Connecticut Compromise, and we create one legislative branch based off of both plans. Meaning, one house is based off population, the other house is based off everybody's the same. Today, everybody based off population, that's what we call the House of Representatives, right? These states like California, New York, Texas, they have more representatives in the House of Reps because they have a greater population, which, by the way, that's why the census this year is taking place, because they need to know how many people are in each state. The other house would be the Senate, right? All senators. Each state gets 2 senators, everybody's the same. That's the New Jersey plan. So the bicameral legislature means cameral house, 2 houses, create one. We call that Congress, the legislative branch. Southern states, though, they want slaves to be counted in their population, but they don't want them to vote. So they come up with a 3/5 compromise. 3/5 of a state's slaves would be counted towards population. Why? Well, because there are not a lot of white dudes in the South. There's actually more slaves in states like Georgia. So they want a lot more representatives. How do they do that? They count some of the slaves, only 3/5 of them. Separation of powers, like I said before, just make sure you know that. Every branch has its own power. They separate power, so not one person or branch has all the power. Checks and balances mean that they can all check each other and make sure everything is kosher. Federalism is not the same as a federalist. Federalism means that there's 3 levels of government. There's the federal government. Underneath that's the state government. Underneath the state government is the local government. Okay, and we're all following this idea of republicanism. Okay, so what we have here is the Articles of Confederation versus the Constitution. Kind of mentioned this, but you can take a look at this on your own. But we did say that the Articles of Confederation was very weak. There was a lot of failures with it versus the Constitution, which gives a lot more power to the federal government, which was good. We needed that because we needed more control over things like collecting taxes. We needed a Supreme Court, for example. All right, so you can take a look at that more on your own. Next, we have the question, why is the Constitution ratified? Not everybody's on board. Not all states were on board because you had the disagreements between, was it too powerful? Was it giving too much power to the federal government? And that leads to, the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists, guys like Alexander Hamilton, They're saying that more power was needed to the federal government because of the Articles of Confederation was such a failure, versus the Jeffersonians or the anti-federalists who said we need something to check or basically ensure the people that they are going to have a say in this brand new government. So what they agree upon is the anti-federalists say, hey, listen, we will ratify the Constitution if you include a Bill of Rights. Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution have things, like freedom of speech and religion, the right to bear arms, their right to due process. Those are your Bill of Rights. A couple of other things just to compare and contrast versus the Articles versus Constitution. Shays Rebellion. Daniel Shays, a veteran from the good old American Revolution. He's upset about taxes and this new Articles of Confederation, and he doesn't want to pay his taxes. So him and his homeboys start a little rebellion, and they call up George Washington. Yo, can you put down this rebellion? I can't because the government doesn't have a standing army, it won't pay me, and I don't even have a position in this Articles of Confederation. Awesome. Shays Rebellion reveals the weakness of the Articles. Where the Constitution now has been ratified, the Whiskey Rebellion goes down, and this time George Washington is president. He is the commander-in-chief, and these farmers in Pennsylvania who are upset about the tax on whiskey, they rebel, and George Washington can come in now with his little army on his white horse Nelson and put down the rebellion. This shows that the power of the new federal government is strong enough to put down a rebellion, obviously collect taxes as well. So disagreements arise over the new political, economic, and social identity of this new country. This basically comes down to Hamilton's plan. Hamilton's new financial plan causes a lot of disagreements. There are 4 components to it. I would definitely know the 4 components to it. He is famous for popping up on A Good Short Answer, especially this year with a little writing component. This is a really good opportunity to know the 4 components. So the assumption plan means that all of the revolutionary debts be assumed by the country as a whole, doesn't matter state by state. Excise taxes on things like whiskey, which is going to cause that whiskey rebellion. High tariffs, we talk about tariffs all the time. Tariffs are taxes on imports, so make foreign-made goods more expensive. This way people buy more American-made goods. That helps our economy. And the National Bank is what Hamilton is mostly known for. Hamilton is a Federalist, so he obviously supports this idea. He is a Federalist, meaning that they are supporting the bank. They're more about northern manufacturers, the business owners, strong central government, and interpreting the Constitution loosely. Because remember, the financial plan here, the National Bank, is nowhere talked about in the Constitution, so it's loosely interpreted. Whereas Jefferson and his boys, the Democratic Republicans, they said, no. We not only are Southerners, we not only support more agriculture, we also support a weak central government. We want states to have more power and a strict interpretation of the Constitution, right? If the Constitution doesn't say it, we should not have it. Okay, so definitely know some examples of the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans, Jefferson versus Hamilton, and also what the 2 parties stand for. Okay, so a couple of things to remember in this period is the battle between federal and state governments. This really comes to a head in the Alien Sedition Acts. This goes down in John Adams' presidency, where during his administration they passed these acts that basically say you, as a foreigner, could be expelled, that you could be also punished for speaking your mind, and then response to that is, by the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which is written by Jefferson and Madison, they say, wait, we have First Amendment rights. You can't punish people for speaking their mind. You can't punish them for speaking out against the government. Now, really what was going on is Adams was really pissed off because mostly French people in America were speaking out against this new government. Now, because of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, they set a very dangerous precedent. What Jefferson and Madison have done here with these resolutions is they basically allow or say that if a state believes a federal law is unconstitutional, they can nullify it or not listen to it. Very dangerous precedent, because as we know, in the future, nullification is going to come up in the Andrew Jackson era and then later on during the Civil War era. So nullification is something that is set, okay, that is created during this Alien Sedition Acts by John Adams. Okay, so this is not a very good precedent that is put forth by these guys. Foreign disagreements, French Revolution. They helped us in our revolution, then we are supposed to return the favor, right? Not exactly. Okay, we'll talk about Washington in a second, what he wants to do. The Proclamation of Neutrality talks about good old G-dubs saying, hey, listen, although we thank the French for their help, I don't think it's wise that we get involved in their revolution. This is something that he says in 1793, and we pretty much hold on to this foreign policy until we get to the age of imperialism and the world wars and such. Citizen Genet is a guy from France who's traveling the country here in America trying to raise or rally support to help the French in their revolution, and then he's kind of kicked out, and we said, no, we don't want you here trying to stir up some drama. The XYZ affair is really what causes Adams to pass that Alien Sedition Acts. The XYZ affair was us trying to reach out to France saying, hey, listen, stop bullying us, stop impressing our ships. And in response, France wants a bribe. They want money in order to negotiate, and John Adams freaks out and says, absolutely not. A undeclared war or a quasi-war happens, which is basically a big naval battle between us and the French. Nothing really comes of it. It's kind of a stalemate, but we held our own, right? We didn't give in to the demands here of the French. And this all comes to an end as Thomas Jefferson comes to power in 1800. The British drama, after the American Revolution was over, the Treaty of Paris of 1783, they still kind of were bullying us. They're still out on the frontier giving Native Americans guns. We try to solve this with Jay's Treaty, which was supposed to end impressment by the British. But then John Jay comes back and says, this is great, I got a treaty. They talked about, getting rid of some of their forts on the frontier. And then everybody's like, okay, great. Well, what'd they say about impressment? Nothing. So thank you so much, John Jay. It didn't really accomplish what it was supposed to. Awesome. The Spanish drama, they're still in Florida and the Mexico, Texas area. They have control of the lower half of the Mississippi River, which is something we're very interested in. Pinckney's treaty solves that. We do gain access to it, but we obviously have to pay. Washington is out after 2 terms. He sets that precedent. He writes this little farewell address where we must know 2 things that he advises us against. One, he says, don't make alliances because alliances could drag us into future wars. And the second thing is we shouldn't have political parties because parties will divide us as a country. Unfortunately, right after he leaves, or even as he's president, we see political factions being created. The Federalists are guys like John Adams, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton. They favor strong centralized government. They specifically favor England in foreign affairs, whereas the Democratic Republicans are led by guys like Jefferson and Madison, and they're the ones that are favoring the South. They're favoring agriculture. They're favoring a weak central government, and they favor France in foreign disagreements. So definitely know the 2 political parties and know what they stand for and who exactly would be part of each. Okay, so a couple things to finish up with. We have the election of 1800 kind of comes to an end here. The Federalist power, Democratic Republicans win. John Adams is out. He's very upset about that. We'll see some implications about that later on. Thomas Jefferson is in. This is the first time we see the Democratic Republicans in power, and it's a peaceful transition of power between the 2 parties, and sometimes referred to as this Revolution of 1800. A couple things to wrap up here. The Native American narrative in this period. So we'll go back in time a little bit and kind of bring it up to the end of period 3 here. Native Americans, they've had they've had relations with both the British and the French during the French Indian War. A lot of Native Americans chose both sides, but you will see the British promise the Native Americans land if they side with them, and the French will do the same thing. And obviously, the losers are going to be very upset. The Albany Plan occurs during the French Indian War, where Ben Franklin tries to get colonial unity. He tries to get the colonies to unite at this time against the French, not the British. And Iroquois tribe is part of that. The Pontiac's Rebellion and the Proclamation of 1763. So remember, the British try to prevent us from going beyond the Appalachian Mountains and to prevent our manifest destiny. We're not happy about this. You will see some colonists go out and in Pontiac's Rebellion start hacking up some Native Americans and encroaching on their lands. That's not good. American Revolution happens, the Treaty of Paris is signed, and then you have Native Americans losing their land in those 13 colonies now, the United States. Well, you're not going to see them go away. You're going to still see resistance up in the Ohio Valley area. Chief Little Turtle and his Western Confederacy tries to band together as many tribes as possible to resist against the New Americans. They ultimately will lose the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and the Treaty of Greenville was signed, and that's kind of the last resistance in this area between the natives and the Americans until the War of 1812. And then the California and the western coast, we'll see some Spanish missions pop up and converting Native Americans to Catholicism. Okay, last, almost done here. Land Ordinance Act of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. These were two successes of the Articles of Confederation. They set the precedent of how future territories would become states. They also banned things like slavery, which was big. And that's a huge precedent that is set. However, slavery is still going to expand, but as we're going to find out in period 4 and 5, it's going to expand in the south and then later on further out west. But this at this time it's called an Old Northwest because as you can see where it says west on the map there, that's modern day states like Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin area. We're going to start to see in period 4 sectionalism. Okay, so the two sections of the country, the north and the south, and then the third section of the country, the west, as we head further out there. So we're going to see more regional identities come about. And finally, you can just see in this map here land that was lost by Indians, okay, and the key there. And as we head further out west, we're going to keep pushing Native Americans further west. And then obviously once we hit the west coast, there's more conflict later on, but that's a story for period 6. All right, so that's going to be it for this period 3. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. I hope this was helpful. There's a lot of information in this. I will say that they're going to choose something. I think they're going to choose something from this period because it's a hot topic and it's something fresh in everybody's minds. If not, oh well. But there's a lot of good information in here, and I would definitely know how the government is set up and how we set up the Constitution and all the components that go along with it. So hopefully it was helpful. Like I said, click like, subscribe if you find any of these helpful, and have a great and wonderful day. Stay safe and peace out. Deuces.